Thank you all for joining us today for Censorship's webinar on 529 Day. So we're going to have some fun talking about the college search process, admissions, FAFSA, anything and everything. And as you have questions, please feel free to type those in the Q&A little box there. Cozy has some times throughout the presentation to pause for questions, and we'll also do questions at the end. But yeah, Cozy, she's a college search expert that's been doing this for a long time, working for College Inside Track, and so she is gracious with her time to help us kind of navigate this college search process and give us some helpful tips and updates in that landscape there. So, Cozy, I appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the invitation, Derek. All right, let's get rolling then. Let me get my screen shared. All right. So today we're actually going to talk about the strategies around a smarter college search. And the goal here is really, and I'll get it into play mode. Um, the goal here is to really help you guys understand what great college search looks like today, some of the factors that are involved in that. And then as Derek mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and take questions too. So don't be shy. The opportunity always exists for you to ask the questions that you have. I'm happy to take them. This is your opportunity, so feel free. If you're unfamiliar with College Inside Track, we've been around helping families navigate the college search process for almost 20 years now. Not me personally, I've been here for 8, but we've been doing this a long time. And our goal is always the same: to assure that students find right academic, social, and financial fit. So the goal is to make sure your student goes off to colleges they're excited about, where they elbow through a couple majors, because everybody does, but then they get out on time and on budget. And one of the things that we just find to be true is when you get families really good information, they actually make really good decisions. And that just naturally brings down that stress level that can happen during this college search process. So some of the trends that we'll talk about today, we are going to discuss the use of the FAFSA and the CSS profile, what they do and what they can't do for you. We'll talk about how the acceptance landscape continues to change. Some schools' acceptance rates are going down, so the list of selective schools continues to grow, but I'm also going to share some schools where the acceptance rate is going up. We'll talk about grade inflation and testing. And then lastly, when you leave here today, you will understand different application styles, and we'll focus in on early decision and what it does mean and what it does not do for your family. All right, so I always think it's good to kind of lay the landscape a little bit and help you understand kind of what things look like. If we look at our public schools, they've increased their tuitions in the last 30 years by about 213%. That might seem like a big jump, but let's take a look at our private schools. They've actually gone up 415%
Wow.
in that same timeline. But before you get out your wet noodles and start laughing those private schools, let's take a look at our public flagship universities. I live in Minnesota. The University of Minnesota has gone up 570%. You can see University of Iowa down there at 460. The University of Missouri system has gone up about 500%. Kansas is about the same in the last 30 years, but you can see there are some schools well over 1,000%. The goal here, big picture, the highest I've found so far is UConn. University of Connecticut has actually gone up 1,300% in that same time.
Wow. That's hard for me to get my head around.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. It is kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
I think we always have a sense that the cost of college has gone up, but
Yes.
getting a kind of like actual percentage, it actually outpaces any other industry in terms of its increases.
Yeah.
Let's take a look. When I sit down with families, and I do that 300 to 400 times a year in Chat College, It's my favorite part of my job. One of the things that I find is that your kids are bubbling up schools that are in these top 4 or 5 college ranges as schools of interest, right? Tossing out school names because they are interesting, and the students, especially if you've got a sharp student, they want to go to schools that have some kind of brand associated with them. And so I think it's important to understand kind of what pricing looks like at those schools. But the 3 that I want to point out are the 3 at the bottom. These are actually the flagship schools of their states. And one of the things that we see are that the flagship schools are hanging in most states somewhere between 30 and about 35,000 a year. Of course, everything seems to be more expensive in California, and so the UC system well over 40,000. But I will tell you, University of Pennsylvania, an East Coast flagship, of course, is also sitting at about $37,000 a year. So I think this is important because there are a lot of folks who hope to just send their kids off to college for about $20,000, $25,000 a year. And while you can find schools that are that price, one of the things that you'll find is that your kids aren't interested in going to those
Yeah.
schools, right?
Yeah.
So I've yet to have a kid, we sit down for the family consultation and they bubble up Southwest Missouri State.
Yes.
It's just not a
Yeah.
school that kids like toss out. And I'm not suggesting that's not a great school. I'm just saying it's not a brand that kids recognize.
Hmm. Yeah, it definitely feels like a name brand versus generic feel
Yes.
to it, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Who the
Yeah.
white labels are.
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
For sure. So this is a little play along at home quiz. What percentage of students do you think transfer at least one time? So go off to college, discover it's not the right place for them, and have to move on. Is that number 6% of kids, 14%, 25, 38, or 42%? Derek, what do you think?
Uh, I would guess 38%.
Okay. Let's see. The national transfer rate today is, you are correct. It is
Ah, nice.
38%. Well done, you. High five.
Nice.
One of the reasons I bring this up is most people are not interested in overpaying for their students' college education. And one of the easiest ways to keep the price of college down is by keeping your student at the school they started at. When a student transfers from one public institution to another public institution, so we aren't even counting private schools in these numbers, it increases the cost of their degree by about $14,000. And guess what? Of the 38% of kids who made a poor choice the first time, about half of those kids, 46% of those kids, make a poor choice yet again, move on to a third school, and that actually increases the cost of their degree by about $24,000. The primary driver here is the amount of time the student spends in school, right? So what we see is when kids transfer, on average, they spend about an additional year in college. And if they transfer twice, they spend almost an additional 2 years in school. So let's kick this off by talking about financial aid. I am going to stop at the end of this section and take your questions about things like the FAFSA. So if you've got questions in that realm, get ready. When I sit down with families, there are 2 goals that they usually are interested in. Where do we find scholarship dollars, and what is the timing and pacing? But they almost always kick the conversation off by saying something like, well, we're not going to qualify for financial aid. And what they actually mean is that they are not going to qualify for need-based aid. Now, when colleges talk about financial aid, they're actually not just talking about need. They're also including those scholarship dollars that we're going to talk about here in a few slides. Most colleges as well include loans. So when you go out to a college website, because that's what people do, if they want to try and figure out if they can afford this school, they head out there. And one of the things that they'll see is something that says something like, the average student on our campus pays X, or we give away X amount of financial aid. And what you should know is the number that they are showing you is including need-based aid, merit-based aid, and loans. And so the number they're sharing with you has almost no relevancy to what your family's actually going to pay. Because if it's true that you may not qualify for need-based aid, then the number they're showing you is irrelevant, right? Because the average student on every college campus is they take the kid paying the least, the kid paying the most, and they average them, right? Well, that kid paying the least does have need-based aid. So it's important to keep that in mind. The colleges aren't really sharing what you will pay, and that becomes one of the big challenges. There are two forms that a family might find themselves filling out to determine if you have need at a college campus. The first form everybody's pretty familiar with, or at least by name, you know that they're going to ask you for a FAFSA form. That's the free application for federal student aid. Another form that you'll see asked for on occasion, this tends to be used by more selective schools, not necessarily private, like UNC Chapel Hill and University of Michigan both use this form as well, the CSS profile. Today, these two forms, the FAFSA and the CSS profile, kick out a number that is now referred to as the Student Aid Index. You might recognize a term called expected family contribution. That term has been retired. And so now the outcome of the FAFSA is called the Student Aid Index. When you get your student report back after you filled out your FAFSA, it'll say something like SAI, and then it gives you a number. The number looks like a code, but it's not a code, it's a dollar figure. No dollar signs, no commas, no decimal points, but it is a dollar figure. So I think it's helpful for families to understand actually how the formula, the FAFSA, gets broken out. And I think this is important because sometimes people say to me, we shouldn't have saved for college. We could have maybe been need-based, but we did. And so now we're not going to get access. And here's the reality. There are two groups of people whose information has to be included in the FAFSA. The first group of people, of course, are parents. And yes, you do have to include your information. We'll talk about that here in a second. But when we look at how assets and income are assessed through the FAFSA formula, you can see there is far more weighting on the income side of the house versus the asset side of the house. And so whatever you've saved for college is really getting assessed at a really low rate. And if you think about the use of, since it's 529 day, if you think about the use of a 529, most people started saving in that when their kids were small fries, right? Little kids. The growth over time that's happened to that 529 plan has far surpassed this little tiny 5.64% assessment rate. The other thing is, with a lack of savings, often what ends up happening is that people have to substitute in loans, and the interest on loans will also far surpass this little tiny 5.64% assessment rate. So you should be glad you're saving for college, and don't think about it from a somehow it's penalizing you. It is not penalizing you. The second group of people who have to put their information on a FAFSA are your students, of course. Technically, it is their FAFSA. So if you have two kids going off to college, you will be filling out two FAFSA forms because it's assigned to the student, not the family. Students have to assess their assets at 20%, their income at 50%. Good news, most students don't have much of either of these, and so it doesn't usually sway the FAFSA outcome very much. If you have a third party who's going to help you pay for college, this could be a grandparent, an auntie, an uncle, a godparent. It could be anybody who wants to help a student. Those people do not get assessed at all. So their information does not actually ever find its way onto a FAFSA form. It can be a very helpful thing for families to have a third party who is helping them out. All right, so at the end of the slide, I'll take your questions. So get them ready. I don't know if do you want them to drop them in the Q&A, Derek?
Yeah, the Q&A would be great. Yeah, type those questions in there.
Okay, sounds great. So here's the deal. My first tip for you, there are going to be 4 of these today. The FAFSA can't really be manipulated. At the end of the day, most parents can't remove themselves from a FAFSA form. Gone are the days where you could just say, like, oh, I'm not going to claim my student as a dependent anymore. They're independent. And so just know that's not a thing. The status of independence has very clear criteria, and most 18-year-olds don't fit into the criteria list. When you fill out your FAFSA form, make sure that you do not include retirement accounts, and you should also not include your primary residence. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a vacation home in the Ozarks or something, you do need to include that. But you do not have to include your primary residence. If you have
And
any
for those
small,
retirement accounts, those are Roth IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, 457, things of
correct,
that nature. Okay.
all
Yeah,
of those.
great. Great.
Cash value life insurance, anything that's considered a qualified retirement account does not go on.
Good.
If you have a small business or you're a farmer, you have to include the assets of that business. So you actually have to include the net value. So you take the market value, you get to subtract the debt, and then whatever is left over is what you end up claiming. Just keep in mind that if you have assets associated with your business, you do need to include those in the market value. So capital equipment, for instance, if you're a farmer, we have farmers in our family, that would be like your big farm equipment, um, any of the buildings, the value of your land, all of that stuff needs to be included. If you have divorce as part of your family scenario, only one parent is going to fill out the FAFSA form. And in 2024, they changed the rules around the FAFSA, around who is going to actually be the parent who fills it out. And today it's determined by which parent is financially supporting the students more. So here's the deal, though. They didn't bother to define financial support. So I can't tell you, oh, count this, this, and this in financial support. What I tell people is as long as you could show documentation that justifies the decision that you made, that's what you want to think about. In the event that both parents contribute 50-50, you actually have to choose the household with the higher household income.
Yeah.
So if you're remarried, you need to include the income of a step parent, for instance. If you have multiple kids going off to college at the same time, just know that that does not impact your need. It actually makes it less likely that you will get need-based aid. So if you did not qualify with one student going off to school, you will not qualify with two. It used to be the case where people often did. So the way that it used to work is they would take that 47% of your income assessment and they would split it between the two kids, 23 and a half and 23 and a half. Under the new FAFSA rules, they now assess your income at 47% for student one and 47% for student two. So in essence, the formula assumes that you can spend 94% of your income sending your kids to college. I can just tell you in my household, that would not be happening.
Well, that's how they got to that 1,300% increase that
Yeah,
you got there. You spend
that's
90
right.
on
That's
us
right.
and 10 to live on. Good.
The last thing I want to mention about the FAFSA, though, is there are a lot of schools that use this as a demonstration of your ability to pay. And so one of the things the FAFSA form does is demonstrate your interest in this school. That actually increases your students' likelihood of success at a college. And so even if you're a high net worth family, I highly recommend that you still fill out your FAFSA form for that reason, because there's no way to identify which schools do that and which schools don't. And so just make sure you get your FAFSA filled out, and you would fill it out in fall of senior year for your first time. All right, let's take questions. It looks like they're
Good.
popping in.
Yes, we have some questions here. First one around for the FAFSA, are Roth conversions factored into parent income too? So, someone's maybe doing aggressive conversions earlier on in their working years, and that kind of overlaps with college. How does that play out into the FAFSA?
Help me understand what a Roth conversion is.
Yeah, so just taking some money in a pre-tax, they're both qualified plans, but you're taking some money from a pre-tax IRA and moving it over to a Roth IRA. So that shows up on the tax return as income, but it's income kind of with going in between qualified plans. And so curious to how that might impact the FAFSA.
Got it. Thank you. So if it shows up on your tax return for that year, it will actually impact your income assessment,
Okay.
right? So they'll assess that with the rest of your adjusted gross income.
Okay.
You would not need to claim anything additional in the asset area.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And then part two of the question they had was how many years into the past do they look at parent income? Is it only the year you're filling out the FAFSA, or is there a look back period?
Yeah, great question. So the FAFSA today, typically people fill it out in October.
Okay.
So October of your student senior year would be the first time. Well, your current tax year is not completed yet. And the FAFSA form you're filling out, hang with me, is actually for the following year, right? So this coming fall, people will be filling out the FAFSA form for the 2026-2027 calendar year. And so the look back is 2 years previous to the actual FAFSA form you're filling out. So families this year who have a senior this year, who filled it out last fall, we're filling out the 2025 FAFSA because it's going to give you your financial impact for the school year 2025-2026. And so it was taking into account the 2023 income year. Assets are a snapshot in time. So you are just looking at your assets in that particular moment that you are filling out your FAFSA, but the income is 2 years previous to the actual FAFSA you're filling out. So if you're filling out the 2026 FAFSA, it'll look at 2024 calendar year for your taxes.
Okay, good. And then for parents filling out the FAFSA, if are there any considerations around if the parent has student loans, like when they're looking at asset and income, is that impacted in any
Yeah,
fashion
this
for
is
the,
a very good question. Debt is not factored. Parent debt is not factored into the
okay.
FAFSA.
Okay. Okay. Good, good. And then when that number three bullet there, the small businesses, farm assets, how how do you value a small business for their purpose there? Is it just kind of a best guess, or do we need something a little bit more formal? What are they looking for?
This is a great question. The short answer is gut check it.
Okay.
So if you were to turn around and sell your business tomorrow, what would it be worth? And I
Yeah.
know that for some businesses, for instance, that's really hard to figure out. And so in
Hmm.
essence, for instance, services, your book of business has to be worth something to someone else, right? In essence.
Hmm.
And so in many cases, there's not going to be much there if you're a services-based business. Um, the people who really take the hit are people who have kind of physicality to their business, right? Like farmers, for instance, or even like a small manufacturer. If you're a boutique owner, your unsold merchandise has value, for instance. And so here's the cool part. When you go to fill out your FAFSA, if you say, yes, I own a small business, a whole little box pops up that tells you how to estimate that value.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
so it'll walk you through the steps to get that done.
Good, good. Last question on the FAFSA is kind of like in your experience, like how often are changes being made to the FAFSA, the rules around it? Like, is that something we should just keep our ears open every year, or?
Yeah,
or-
this is a great question. These 2024 FAFSA changes actually took place for the first time. The legislation passed in December of 2020. So it took a while for them to roll out. And then probably if you ever watched the news last year, you heard about how horrible the rollout was. But prior to those changes, literally the FAFSA rules had not changed in more than 15 years.
Okay.
So I wouldn't expect there to be significant FAFSA changes. Now, there are some rumblings in the current administration about changing some things like, for instance, having the federal government get out of the loan business altogether. And if that happened, the FAFSA would probably basically disappear. So, because that's what it's for. And so more to come there. But as of right now, I don't anticipate big changes to the formula itself.
Okay. Good. I think that's all the questions on FAFSA there.
Awesome. Let's move ahead then, because at the end of the day, many of you who are on today are not going to actually qualify for need-based aid. And that's okay. I mean, it doesn't feel great. I get that. I have 5 kids, totally understand. But at the end of the day, you either will or won't be need-based. You really can't manipulate that FAFSA, as I mentioned. And so instead, you're going to want to focus on schools that can get you to pricing that you're comfortable with in other ways. And this is where I need to get you off of the 1995 version of Let's Go to College, and let's get you into the 2025 version of Let's Go to College. So what I need you to do is just kind of ditch old world thinking around things like public schools, private schools, in-state schools, out-of-state schools. Today, colleges are flexibly priced or they are inflexibly priced, because we've got public, private, in-state, out-of-state in both of those categories. And by the way, these are not good or bad. So it's not good flexible pricing and bad inflexible pricing. It just is. But understanding how the college thinks about this and what they do is the important piece here. And so I'm going to use the state of Michigan as our example here. It's a multiple public institutions in the state of Michigan. We've got the big dog, right? University of Michigan, but then we've also got Michigan Tech and Michigan State, and then we've got smaller publics in that state as well. And so when we look at the top tier, University of Michigan is inflexible. Now, if you're a resident of the state of Michigan, their pricing is relatively reasonable. It's about $35,000, like most of the big flagship schools. But if you're a non-resident, they are inflexible, and you have to decide if $80,000 a year is worth it to you. So same exact school, same inflexible pricing, but whether it feels good or doesn't feel good has to do with where you're at, right? Now, if we look at Michigan State and Michigan Tech, these guys, also public institutions, are flexibly priced. They actually have scholarships available. They're relatively predictable scholarship dollars. And so most people will find those relatively reasonable when we compare them to the $80,000 if you're a non-resident. But if we look at the smaller Northern Michigan, Western Michigan, Eastern Michigan, Oakland, these are all public institutions in the state of Michigan. These guys are inflexibly priced by and large, but they don't charge out-of-state tuition. Everybody goes for in-state prices. And so you could go for less than $25,000 a year. And so that's where it's important to just understand how the landscape works. My bottom 3 kids are great examples of this. One of my kids went to University of Minnesota. We're residents in the state of Minnesota. One of my kids went to a private school. She went to Drake University in Des Moines. And one of my kids went to University of Missouri, Kansas City. Of those 3 schools, the least expensive was the private school, and it was less expensive than our flagship school by about $10,000 a year. The next on the list was University of Missouri, Kansas City, and they were about $8,000 less a year than the University of Minnesota, and the University of Minnesota was the most expensive of the 3. So it's important today to get yourselves out of that kind of old thinking, because the landscape simply does not work that way any longer. Colleges are your single largest source of scholarship dollars, not the internet. There's no magic box of scholarships out on the internet. There are a lot of scholarships out there, but your student has such a low probability of winning them that they really aren't worth your time and energy. And private parties, back in the day, we used to hop around town. You'd stop at the bank and some of the local retailers, and you might manage to gather up, $300, and congrats, you bought a quarter of your education. Today, you can do that same hop about. Congrats, your student manages to garner $1,000, and congrats, you bought books, right?
Yeah.
So you just have to decide if the time and energy is worth it for those. Who you want to focus on are the colleges. So today, the way we think about the scholarship landscape is the price you pay for college is directly related to these three things. And the biggest of these three are the schools that make it to the list in the first place. Because if your student is interested in Northwestern in Chicago, there are no scholarship dollars available at that school. None, zero, zip, doesn't matter how interesting your student is. If they want to go down to Rice, Duke, Stanford, all the Ivies, Johns Hopkins, name your highly selective school here. Those schools don't budge their pricing. And so it's important to know that the colleges that make it to the list are the number one way that you control what you're going to pay for college. After the schools that make it to the list, other things that impact scholarship dollars include the decisions your student's going to make in high school, and then how they tell that story on their essay or application. So what should you be looking for if schools are your goal to bringing down the price of college? Well, again, the first thing you have to know is, do they even offer merit scholarship dollars to start with? Merit has everything to do about your student, but it's important for you to put your business hats on. Schools give away this money because your student is helping them with things that they care about. So, what do they care about? Well, they're looking for students who can help them increase their average grade or GPA and their test scores, right? So they're measuring the average incoming GPA for their freshman classes every single year. And if your student can help them bump that up, there's more money on the table. This is true as well in the test space. More and more schools are going back to test required. And even for the schools who aren't test required, they are still looking for students who can help them increase their average incoming test scores. Extracurricular talents matter, but not classically in the way that people think. And we're going to talk about that in a couple slides. And then be demographically interesting. This is super easy to do. It's just that most people don't do it. I was one of these people, by the way. I told my kids, stay in the state, go to a state school. Lucky for me, I bumped into College Inside Track because I was a client back in the day. It turns out your kids way more interesting out of their state than in their state, because you know what? The one thing that University of Missouri does not need is more Missouri applicants. Kansas does not need more Kansas applicants. And so you are more interesting out of your region than in your region.
Mm.
So I just want to give you a feel for how colleges think. This is what schools are giving away money for. This is a specific school's recipe, but it is also aligned with other schools. And if they are a non-merit school, these are always the things that schools are thinking about from an acceptance perspective as well. So demonstrated interest is your students' interaction with that school. Things like touring, following their social media, going to the ice cream social for the alumni that you were invited to. All of those things play into this. Look at this, just for living out of state, right? This school's bringing as much as 15 grand per year for a student who is interesting to them. The next few, of course, are about finding students who will be successful. Really big picture, this is what schools are interested in. Finding kids who will come, elbow through those couple majors, and still get out in 4 years, because they measure their 4-year graduation rate. So they're looking for students who will be successful on their campus. The colleges do care about seeing the numbers from your FAFSA, and many of them will bring money to the table for these things. And so I want to make sure that you understand that filling out your FAFSA form is not only helpful for the college, but it could also be helpful for you. They actually do bring scholarship money, not for the outcome of the FAFSA, but just that you filled it out in the first place. And then a really well-written essay, of course, can be worth a lot of money as well. We spend a ton of time with our kids on their essays when we work with families because it's such an important part of both the acceptance process today, but also the scholarship process. All right, I'm going to walk through early decision, and then I will take your next round of questions. So if you have questions, drop them in to the Q&A. I want to talk about early decision because this is a landscape change that we are seeing. More and more schools are stepping into this space. If you use the early decision application, it is exactly what it sounds like. It is a decision. Your student is saying, hey, college, if you let me in, I'm coming.
Mm.
So it's important to understand that it's a decision made. And if your student isn't ready to make that decision in the fall, then don't use the ED application. You only get to use this one time. So you can only apply to one school early decision, and so use it strategically. We spend a great deal of time working with our students to say, for the kids who are going to use this, and not many do, by the way, because most kids aren't ready in the fall to make the decision. But if we're going to play the card, let's play it at the place where it gets the student the most. So, for instance, significantly increases the likelihood of success at that school. Some schools only take 10% of their freshman class out of early decision applicants. Other schools take as much as 60 and 70% out of early decision. So, understanding what that looks like and then playing the card in the right place is really important. Early decision does not restrict your ability to apply to other schools' early action or regular decision. You cannot use early decision more than once. And in fact, if they're Common App schools, it won't even let you check the box for early decision. But you cannot use it at more than one school, but you can apply to other schools so that if you don't get into that school, you're still playing the game, right? You're still applying to colleges. I'm just going to recommend that you not use early decision if you can't afford the school. So some people will say to me, well, Cozy, you can back out for financial reasons. I know that's one of the new rules. And I say, yep, you're right, you can. But you don't find that out. You don't find out the financial side of this until spring. And in the meantime, your student fell in love with this school, took the time and energy it takes to apply to that school, and then in spring you're going to tell them, just kidding, you can't go, right? It's just a bad idea. We've seen that play out. It's not pretty. It was not what we recommended. It can be a very, very stressful piece that can be easily avoided. If you're not sure if you can afford the school, apply early action. More selective schools are leaning into the use of early decision. And I want to be really clear, these are not just selective schools. There are public flagship schools that use early decision. University of Minnesota has an early decision option. University of Wisconsin has an early decision option. There are also private schools you've never heard of. There's a school in Minnesota called St. Olaf. St. Olaf uses early decision. So lots and lots of schools are leaning into early decision. Part of the reason they're doing that is because it's a guaranteed freshman class for them. So it benefits them. But the one thing I want to say to you is if you put all your eggs in a single basket, you have to know that you are not going to get the same financial package if there were scholarships involved that you would have gotten had you applied early action. Because you told them, I'm coming no matter what. So just keep that in mind. All right, do we have any questions, Derek?
Yeah, can you, so for this early decision, what are some, it is a decision, but you'd mentioned there's some things that you might be able to get out of it with, like financial circumstances or whatnot. What are some
Yep.
things that so you can kind of unwind from this early decision process? What are some reasons you could get out of it?
Yeah, the only reason is I can't afford this school,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So once you get the financial package back from them, if you truly can't afford, you can approach the school and say, I'm sorry, we can't afford this school, we can't come. Otherwise, and nobody's taking you to court over this. right? But one of the things that we just tell people is it, be respectful of the school's policies, but also be respectful of your students' heart, if you will, and use it at the schools that make sense for you.
Yeah. So yeah. So if the student has a change of heart, financially it can do it, but just a change of heart, like, hey, my all my friends aren't going there anymore. They're going somewhere else. I don't want to go there. Like that, they're still going to their first. That decision's still in play for them to. They got to fulfill that.
That's correct. That's
Yeah.
correct. And like I said, if it's a Common App school, all those other schools could see that you
Yeah.
applied for the decision. So
Okay.
I don't recommend, and that scenario in particular, I think, is a really good example of you got to get back to the basics of academic fit, social fit, and
Hmm.
financial fit, right? Because your student choosing, I think and this happens a lot. So I love this example that you gave, Derek. Students choosing to go off to this school over here because all their pallies are going may not be the best decision for that student. And so in year two, as they start to mature, then they go, okay, I'm only really hanging with like one or two of those guys now. And I don't really like this school. Now you're back to that. I'm transferring, and now you're probably increasing the cost of that degree. So it's so important on the front side to figure out those fit pieces, which is why we like to start working with students sophomore, junior year, so that we have the time to really dig through what does fit actually mean.
Yeah. What is the earliest you'd recommend doing if you're going the early decision route? What is the earliest?
So early decision has a dedicated deadline at each school.
Okay.
Often it's November 1st.
Okay.
But some schools it's earlier than that. There are a few schools that have October deadlines. And so if you're going to use early decision, be really conscious of what the deadline is at that school. Some schools have something called early decision two. So if you don't get accepted at early decision one, you can make the decision if you like to apply early decision two. They might also even recommend it. Up to you whether or not you want to do that.
Okay. And then on early action, you had mentioned that how it's different than early decision. Can you highlight some of the features or experiences with early action, cutoff dates, or just what you experienced going that route versus early decision?
Yep. So early action or early application, you'll see both words, is really a student's opportunity to demonstrate interest, if you will. So it's not a decision. It says to the school, I love you so much. I got my act together and got all this stuff out the door on your deadline. Typically, these are also November 1, November 15th, December 1, December 15th. Each school has their own deadlines, so be really conscious of the deadlines because if you miss them, you are automatically in the next group, unless that school does rolling decisions. So early action can often bring more scholarship money to the table versus not with early decision. So by and large, for most of our students, for their favorite schools at least, we recommend early action.
Good. And then, is there another? So we had early decision, early action. Is there another one
Yep,
to touch
there's
on there?
regular old
Okay.
decision. Just kidding, there's no old in there, but
Yeah.
regular decision deadlines for a lot of schools are actually into the new year, right? So you're applying fall of senior year. Some of those regular decision deadlines start in January, February, March. If it's the only timeline the school has, there are schools that just have one deadline. That's it. That's all they do. The University of California system is like this. Then that's your deadline.
Okay.
Um, we recommend people try and get their applications out the door by December 31st.
Okay.
Um,
Good.
the goal, big picture, is to be ahead of those people who are applying in March. The other thing you should just know is if you're still applying in February and March, a lot of the money is already gone. And so your package is
Yeah.
not going to look the same. So we really recommend hitting either early action or if you're going to use regular decisions, still get your application out the door by the end of December, especially for schools that have kind of rolling acceptances.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. Awesome. Well, I think that covers the questions there. Yeah, good.
Awesome. Let's talk acceptance rates. So I just want people to understand how this landscape is changing. We're starting to see this kind of interesting divide. More and more schools falling into the highly selective space. Some schools that have bounced into there in the last few years would include Case Western, Wake Forest, Boston College, Tulane. All of these schools are now starting to lean into under 20% acceptance rates. And you can see the acceptance rates here. I just want to point out this is not just a private school issue or challenge. You can see the bottom three here actually public institutions. That University of Texas number is a non-resident number. So if you're not a resident, that's your opportunity. UNC Chapel Hill is less than 8% for non-residents. The UC system is well under 5% for non-residents. So it's important to keep that in mind. Other schools, on the other hand, have acceptance rates that are rising. And why does this matter? It matters because take a look at these schools. These are great schools, great colleges and universities, great education, and you have a higher likelihood of scholarship dollars at these schools because their acceptance rates are well over 30%, most of these. And I have a hard time imagining, let's look at Michigan, right? We've got an increased acceptance rate here, 71 to 88%. And you're going to tell me that their education is so much better than University of Michigan at 17%. The reality is your student could get a great education at any of the colleges listed here. UConn's a great school, Ball State, great school, DePaul, great school. These are all great schools, and these will have much more money available than the schools on that first list. I also think it's important to really take a look at the average incoming GPA because I still meet a lot of families who think their student can just waltz into the local flagship school. And the reality is that most of the flagship schools are well over a 3.6 today. In the Big Ten, what we see is the average incoming GPA for those schools are hanging at 3.7 plus, right? The one thing I want to point out is schools are always evolving. University of Tennessee prior to COVID had an average incoming GPA of a 3.4, but now because Clemson has gotten so challenging, the new Southern school that people are leaning into is University of Tennessee. And so it's gone from a 3.4 to a 3.66, and it is on the rise. So it's important to understand. And the reason you want to understand this is you're going to have to balance your students' list for risk. Which schools are riskier than other schools? Acceptance is more than just grades and test scores, though. The students are being evaluated in other ways. Certainly, if you're looking at big brand schools or those more selective schools, your student has to be more than smart. They need to have done something extra that attracts the attention of the school. People joke about, curing cancer and stuff like that, but it could be a passion project. It could be, we had a student who collected vintage Japanese clothing. That was his thing, right? And so he created kind of a passion project around that. He ended up doing kind of a photo essay of the display of this really cool clothing. So there are a lot of things your student can do, right? It doesn't have to be curing cancer. It has to align with who they are. And you might be thinking to yourself, Cozy, my kid is not interested in those schools. Great. You still need to think about, though, how is your student going to tell their story? Right? How are they going to demonstrate who they are to the colleges they're applying to? And so thinking about those activities, the colleges don't need your student to be well-rounded. They need well-rounded campuses. They just need your student to be who they are. And so at the end of the day, thinking about what does my student care about? What are they into? And make sure that their activities align appropriately. Quick quiz for you. In 2002, there were 134 perfect ACTs. How many were there in 2022, just 20 years later? Is that number 306, 585, 1257, or 2542? Guesses, Derek?
I would guess 1257.
Yeah, close, close. It actually was way up at
Oh,
2,542.
wow.
Brings me to my next tip. Tests do still matter, plan appropriately. Today, the colleges don't actually care which of the two tests you take. You can take the
Okay.
ACT or the SAT. They don't care. It's not geographic anymore like back in the day. And so your student should figure out which of the two tests is better for them and choose that test. Schools are stepping back into tests required. There was a really interesting study that came out that demonstrated pretty compelling evidence, if you're a college, that standardized test scores is a better indicator of college success than GPAs. And that has everything to do with the artificial grade inflation happening in our high schools through weighting of classes. And so consequently, schools are kind of leaning back into that test required space. Get prep that fits your student. They're going to be competing against kids who have, and so get something that makes sense for you. There's lots of online, there are individual test prep people. There are lots of ways to do this. It doesn't have to be expensive. And then you can make decisions about sending your test score off after the test is done. When you're done, you know you're not going to take it again. The average student takes it twice. Then you can go back in. Both sites, the SAT and the ACT, prompt the student to put school codes in when they register. I wouldn't recommend doing that. Wait until you're done and then go back in and send the school codes. I'm going to leave you with this thought: search for success, not brand. College is a match that you should make. It's not a prize, right? Everybody runs around, of course, the day after they get accepted with the sweatshirt on their club, the school they're going to. But that lasts a day. They actually have to produce results when they get there. So when you think about this, right, going back to academic, social, and financial fit, all schools are not the same academic environment. You can ask for a different teaching and look for a different teaching format. Not every school is butt-in chair learning. There are lots of schools that are more hands-on environments. There are schools that do a cooperative program where you're working in your field while you're getting your degree. So think about what your student might be most successful in. 80% of kids change their major, 80, just plan for it, right? And so start looking for the ability of your student to elbow through a couple majors. What else are they going to do on this campus besides the thing that they're talking about today? Because it's probably not going to be the thing that they end up wrapping up their college life with. And then think about what kind of support they need on campus. If your student has a 504 or an IEP, you can actually transition that into something called a college accommodations plan. But even for the 4.0 kids who are going off to college, most of them stumble, fall, and scrape their academic knees for the first time ever. And so talking ahead of time about how common it is to get tutoring. And if you're not a great writer, you can go to the writing center and have them help you with essays, et cetera. So starting to talk about support before your student even goes off to school is a really important part. And when you're doing your college tours, asking what kind of support is available on campus helps introduce that concept to your student, no matter what kind of student they are. A little bit about us, and then I'll take your final questions. The college landscape changes literally daily these days. And so having somebody who's sitting in your corner helping you understand how to think about this in a more strategic way, helping your student understand what to do and when to do it, is an important part of the process today. And that's exactly what we do. When we work with families through this process, that 38% transfer rate drops to less than 4%. The goal is really right fit first time. We ensure the schools that make it to the list actually meet your budget, whatever that budget is. So there's no guessing here. You'll actually know the price before you even apply. And then we get to be a neutral third party. This is probably my favorite slide. 5 kids, 4 are girls. They have all mastered the eyeball roll, and they're all adults, and I still don't get to be the smartest person in the room. And so getting to be that neutral third party for your student can be really
Yep.
helpful, bring that stress level down, of course.
Yes.
So this is the coolest thing I want to offer to do. I meet with families, I mentioned this earlier, every single day of the week, but Sunday, the goal here is making sure that people have good information. We're going to sit down for a free consultation. I'm going to answer your questions. You'll bring your student and your questions. We'll discuss those goal areas, academic, social, and financial, and I can give you strategies that work. I'll walk you through a timeline as well. I can help you estimate your FAFSA outcome so you'll know. are we going to be need-based or not need-based? And then how do we think about getting schools on the list that meet our budget? So if you want to take advantage of that family consultation, you have a sophomore or a junior, or even this time of year, if you have a rising senior, we can still meet. Go ahead and use the QR code. It takes you to a Google form. And just let me know, and Alyssa will reach out to you and get you on my calendar. If you have a small group, you're thinking, man, I wish that my daughter's hockey team had seen this. Happy to do a small group presentation for you too. We don't charge to speak. And so I just want people to really understand how this works. Happy to send you a copy of this deck. So feel free to request that through the QR code. And then we do have a family newsletter. It comes out once a month. It has great tips that just kind of follow the natural college path. So I'm happy to share that with you as well. All
Yeah,
right.
those are great resources, and we'll be sure to include those on the follow-up email. And yeah, so a couple questions here towards the end. This one is around the passion project. So, how would you recommend helping a child find a meaningful passion project while also trying to balance GPA, the testing, and all the curriculars?
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing I always want people to know is quality of experiences will always trump quantity of experiences. So don't feel like your student has to do everything they don't.
Yeah.
The other thing then, how do you figure out what that passion project might be? Start with what does your student love? Then turn, if you will, to the people you know. Does anybody you know kind of work in that field, have connections in that field? Then look at your community. And then look at your state. So for instance, I worked with a student last week who super interested in hunting and fishing, was trying to figure out like, what could I do to demonstrate that more than just go hunting and fishing?
Yeah.
So we suggested they go out to the DNR website, look to see where they're looking for volunteers this summer. And so think about like community resources, your personal connections and network. Those are good places to start. Harder places are things like internships and getting your local college to make space. With a lot of the grant reductions funding research, a lot of master's and PhD kids are actually fighting for those spaces. And so I might turn to your community first.
Yeah, good. This was earlier on in the presentation. There was a slide with all the list of schools and the cost. Was that those numbers there? Were they room and board? What all did those capture?
Yeah. So those numbers were total cost of attendance. So
Okay.
don't panic, that was not just tuition.
Okay.
It actually includes everything. It includes tuition, room and board, books, fees. And then most of those schools also include a small amount for personal expenses. We find that they completely underestimate how much pizza freshmen eat. And so we actually bump that up. We usually put in about $3,000 for personal expenses.
Okay. Good. And then we talked, a little bit about the FAFSA there, but the CSS profile, do that tend to have similar deadlines as the FAFSA, or there something else you need to be aware of there?
Yeah, great question. So yes, the CSS profile does often also get filled out in October of your student's senior year. Make sure that your school wants it first, though. There's no reason to fill that out if they're not asking for it. It's a
Okay.
private form. It's actually owned by College Board, the same group that owns the AP tests and the SAT. And so the schools that use it don't actually share the results with you. And one of the things you should just know is because it's a no holds barred kind of form, you actually do need to include retirement accounts, your primary residence, but it also takes into account debt. Big picture, what we see is that families tend to be a little less needy when they have to fill out a CSS profile.
Gotcha. Question. We talked a little bit about essays and how that can, the dollar amount. I think it was maybe 2 to 15,000, or maybe it's 2 to 8, but it was a meaningful amount that can be impacted
Yep.
with what you received there. How has AI kind of impacted that area? Maybe that specific area, or just in general, the college process. Like, are you seeing students get slapped on the hand for trying to sneak something by? Like oh, I wrote this, or I don't know, but I'm just interested to hear your comments around AI and the college search process and how that's been.
This is a really good question. Some of the areas that we see AI impacting, acceptances. Some schools
Mhm.
are actually building AI models that sort through the applications for them. You might recognize this if you've ever applied for a job, right? They've got, of course, models that do that in the resume space as well. We don't think big picture that benefits the students, but it is doing some of the early sifting. Some schools are actually coming right out and saying it'll be making final decisions, which I feel like is horrific, but personally, um,
Yes.
but not too many schools using it that way. From a student perspective, it's a really interesting, evolving area. What I will say is what we've seen so far is that AI driven essays don't tend to be as personal, right?
Yeah.
The schools are really looking for the student to tell a story about themselves that the school can't find anywhere else. It's not sitting on their transcript, it's not sitting on their application. And so consequently, is really challenging, at least right now, for AI models to get something that is that personal. Now, could a student have a student or have an AI model build out like the outline for that?
Yeah.
Sure, they probably could do that. But I would highly encourage still the writing to look like your student, to
Yeah.
sound like your student, because these are not, I always joke, these should not sound like a 40-year-old woman wrote them, right? They still need to
Right.
sound like a high school student.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and I'm sure this will be an evolving area. We'll see more to come,
Hmm.
what it could be used for specifically. But for the time being, I would just encourage your student, give it a go.
Yeah.
Once you choose your story, which is the hardest piece, we do a workshop helping kids choose the story because that's the hardest part. After that, it's your student's story. They just have to
Hmm.
tell it.
Yeah.
So I always tell people try not to sweat that piece too much.
Okay. Good. Good. Awesome. Well, Cozy, I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to share some helpful tips and information there. Yeah, it's always good to get a refresher on the college search process, how that's changing. Like you said, it's an industry, it's changing day by day. And so we appreciate the work you do in that space and helping the families that you help there. It's a good thing, and it's good to have a guide through that process there. And so we appreciate you. For you guys on the call, stay tuned. We'll have some additional resources we'll send out, and like I said, there, Cozy's got her great lineup of resources there that we'll include on our email. But, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me,
All
Derek.
right.
Take care,
Thanks,
everybody.
Cozy. Take care. Bye.